Hello, friends of SuperLuchas. Welcome to the second episode of the SuperLuchas Podcast with your host and friend, Milton Eloir, and the editorial director of SuperLuchas, Ernesto Ocampo. Hello, Ernesto. How are you?
Very well. And you?
Very well. Enjoying this exercise. Thanks to the people who left their comments, who have already subscribed, who like this platform to continue with this SuperLuchas Podcast. We will also be reading your messages that you leave us. Hey, Ernesto, starting with the podcast, I just had a doubt reading the summaries. There are people who still consider there are three different meanings for the concept of wrestling. They say that American wrestling is one thing, Mexican lucha libre is another, and the Japanese term puroresu is yet another. I'm bad at Japanese. I've never pronounced Japanese, but it's a contraction to say professional wrestling. It's also like a different sport. Are they really different sports or just different interpretation? Wrestling, lucha libre, and puroresu
are exactly the same sport, the same show. At the beginning of the century, when the internet started, it was thought they were different things, maybe because of translations. I mean, they saw the word puroresu, which is pronounced pro-res, which is a contraction, as you said, of pro wrestling. They thought they were simply different sports with different names. Fan from the United States wanted to translate the lucha libre, and the translator told him it meant free fight. That's nonsense, because free fight in Spanish would be pelea libre or pelea gratis. Lucha libre, in fact, the concept, the original word is French, because the first style that was big worldwide was the French style, which was also called Greco-Roman wrestling. During the 19th century, practically all over the world, except in the United Kingdom and the United States, Greco-Roman wrestling was practiced. In Mexico, since the 1840s, that style of wrestling was practiced. So we could call professional wrestling not lucha libre, because the French themselves, when they knew the British style called catch as catch can, they called free wrestling. That is lucha libre. Why libre? Because unlike the wrestling they practiced, you could attack the legs, you could use the legs to make holes. In Greco-Roman wrestling, it's from the waist up. There are moves from that style of wrestling, like the double Nelson, the headlock, the suplex, the Greco-Roman suplex, that were not seen in catch-as-catch-can wrestling. So from there, it is called lucha libre. In Mexico, the first time the word lucha libre was used was, I would say, in the 1910 season in Puebla, the first time there was a wrestling season of catch-as-catch-can held by Andres Balsa, better known as the Bulldog. Moving forward, let's say by the 1930s, it was already the predominant style in Mexico. Few remembered that there had been a Greco-Roman style before.
Look, on this topic, just to make it clear for our audience, we could say that professional wrestling encompasses, well, American wrestling, Japanese wrestling, British wrestling, current, contemporary. It's simply the translation of the word. It doesn't mean different things, although maybe the style could have some accent, so to speak. The style.
They are different in terms of the French style and the British style. As I was saying, from the 1920s, when Ed the Strangler Lewis's style was standardized, we see that it is already the American style of modern professional wrestling, where it stops looking like a sport. When all wrestling worldwide becomes the same style, it's called pro wrestling, professional wrestling. In Mexico, it was necessary to differentiate the old style that was practiced from the 19th century until the 1920s. The greatest exponent in the first 2 decades of the 20th century was Enrique Ugartechea, others like Rosando Arnaiz and Gil Larrea, starting from the 20s, around 26 or so, especially during the season at the Arena Coliseo in Veracruz. He begins to practice only lucha libre, and that name stuck. By the time Fray Nano in the 30s talks about professional wrestling, it's only referred to as lucha libre, synonymous with wrestling over time worldwide, let's say. If you see posters from companies in the United States like Capital Sport, now WWE New York, the posters aimed at the Puerto Rican and general Latino audience say lucha libre. You see posters in Los Angeles, they say lucha libre. You'll see posters with Bruno Sammartino that say lucha libre, not because they are going to practice the aerial style, which is what is believed now, Because if you currently see a poster that says Lucha Libre, it's because they're presenting Mexican wrestlers, and this habit of calling American wrestling wrestling and Mexican wrestling Lucha Libre is very recent. Let's say Spaniards often say that what comes from Mexico is Lucha Libre and what comes from the United States is wrestling. In the 90s, the magazines by George Napolitano published in the United States were published in Spain in a magazine called Estrellas de la Lucha Americana, where such a distinction didn't exist yet, but rather interchangeably lucha and wrestling, because it's the same.
I think, Ernesto, and I insist that when I got into the subject from the early days, I think of the networks, or back then the internet, sometimes it was, pardon the YouTube expression, but it was kind of pretentious, like saying, no, this isn't wrestling, it's Lucha Libre. There were even slogans in Mexican independent companies, or lately the topic of strong style has come up, that this event is strong style type, as if it were something different when it doesn't necessarily have to do with the style type. Many times it's even a matter of marketing, don't you think? Or the way to differentiate, as you say, in the United States or somewhere else, Lucha Libre, to refer to the poster that there will be wrestling with Mexican. Not necessarily that it's something different. I think it's already, in some cases, a mere marketing issue.
Now that you mentioned strong style is the style of New Japan Pro Wrestling to differentiate it from the King Road style of All Japan Pro Wrestling. They are really the styles of each of the companies, strong style as if it doesn't exist. In fact, it was my idea to introduce it into Mexican wrestling in SuperLuchas magazine to promote Daga. That is, he practiced the Mexican strong style, which now has stuck in popular jargon, and now everyone talks about how they practice strong style. There are already teams that have strong style embedded in their name, and what they do is nothing different. Let's say the only one understood to use that concept is Ricky Marvin, because Ricky Marvin really knows how to wrestle in the Japanese style. He wrestles hard. He is a master of the Japanese style, but if Mexican strong style doesn't exist, he gave it his all in every match. There was a time when Ricky Marvin was one of the best wrestlers in the world. He really should have made it to WWE. There was even a time when he asked me to send some videos to WWE. But at that time, WWE wasn't that interested in Latin stars. Vince's concept was that they only needed one, which was Rey Mysterio.
You gave a name to a move by Daga that he never used again, or I don't know if he still uses it, the stiletto. You named Daga's finishing move the stiletto. I'm sure you were the one who gave it that name. I don't know why.
Sí, porque I don't remember why, but
well, let's finish with this topic to move on to the next. The next topic, Ernesto, and it's going to be better, related to these myths, is how sometimes we want to talk. There's a myth from the classic era that suddenly arises and is perhaps part of the mythology of Mexican wrestling. The famous Murciélago Velázquez. In a match, he took out the eye of the wrestler Mercedes Gómez with the famous kick La Filomena, which generated a reputation for great mortality. This move, and that to this day, continues to arise when someone recalls anecdotes of accidents in Lucha Libre, but there's a version.
The match never happened. This time, Mercedes Gómez couldn't fight due to medical advice, and it was Luis Núñez, his rival, Teddy Baños, conducted a thorough investigation, gathering all the articles that talked about the topic as well. They were published in his book, Those Wrestlers from Those Times. Here it talks about how that myth arose. To give you an idea, it says the fact is so distorted that it's not an exaggeration to say that more than 10 different dates have been published. Columnist Efraín Cadena Clavel said it was Sunday, February 26, 1939, Maggie del Ring magazine on April 17, 1938, Luna Cornea magazine on February 19, 1939. Hector Valero said that on June 2nd, 1940, in Lucha Libre magazine, they published a series of articles called The Tragedy of Mercedes Gómez, discussing all this. By the 60s, when Murciélago Velázquez was already older, he even said that he didn't take out his eye, but killed him with a kick. But that's how myths are created in wrestling. Velázquez said the following: "Imagine if it was my strongest blow to kill a man with one hit. All good. That my first match was against Jack O'Brien, an Italian-Mexican, but he liked to use that name. The second fight was against Dientes Hernandez, and the third against Mercedes Gómez, whom I killed, said Murciélago Velázquez himself, who some say was very much a mythomaniac, others that he was very imaginative. What can be said? I mean, these are the myths with which the history of wrestling has been built.
Hey, but he lost his side. Okay, very well. Before moving on to the next topic, there's one more topic. I don't know if you'd like to. There are some questions from our previous podcast. One really caught my attention here. They congratulate you and say they very much agree that the figure of a mentor is needed when writing about wrestling. The majority doesn't really seek to specialize in this topic at a journalistic level. Then another person also congratulates. Finally, a podcast of experts. Excellent podcast. The podcast that was much needed. Wrestling has a greater depth than other types of shows, and they congratulate you. Honor to whom honor is due. Thank you to everyone who sends us these kinds of messages, except those from the disco. In this topic, another myth you wanted to talk about, Ernesto, the topic of wrestling in Mexico. How did Salvador Lutteroth see it, or how did he learn about wrestling? Because there are also many in Mexico. How did it really work? What is the historical truth that you have found?
The most widely told myth is that he saw wrestling in El Paso, Texas. I think he would have seen wrestling in El Paso, Texas, because for the myth to work, he had to see it outside of Mexico. Why? Because according to this, professional wrestling did not exist in Mexico. And well, if we go by what Fray Nano recounts in September 1933, on September 20th and September 21st, in his articles he wrote before and after the event, he says that Lutteroth wanted to start a boxing company. It was Fray Nano who told him, no, wait, there's already a lot of boxing in Mexico. I mean, improve something new, promote wrestling. Wrestling is hardly seen in Mexico. Fray Nano claimed almost all the subsequent credit that Lutteroth received at that moment. There's a fact that Fray Nano himself recounted 10 years later, maybe his subconscious betrayed him, that he said Lutteroth and Ahumada went to see him at his offices of La Afición newspaper and told him they wanted to start a company with boxing and wrestling. In this case, he was the man with the money, the capitalist partner, the businessman, and Ahumada was the promoter. And here in this version, Fray Nano only convinced them not to include boxing, to include only wrestling. This makes a bit more sense because he also mentions an interesting fact. Lutteroth got excited when he saw a wrestling match that was in January 1931. It was Sergeant Russell against George Gottfried that took place in the Arena Nacional. The Arena Nacional used to be the Fronton Nacional. The wrestling season, which really was Lucha Libre, was already catch as catch can, was organized by promoter Antonio Urias with wrestlers from Madison Square Garden. The main wrestler on that tour was a Spaniard, Carlos Enriquez. Well, I think we can talk a lot more about that season later, especially about the scandals that occurred. People started saying, no, that's not fair. They're not really hitting with those holds that make you fall so much. Season was a failure, except for the last one. The last event was because George Godfrey, a very famous boxer who was in Mexico, challenged Jack Russell. That challenge was widely published in the newspapers, and it caused the Arena Nacional to fill up with people wanting to see that match between Russell and Gottfried. Among those attending this match was Lutteroth. That was the match that made Lutteroth see that promoting wrestling could be a business. And above all, the success was based on creating what we would call an angle. You can't create a feud from zero. The previous seasons, or most of the previous seasons, were based on tournaments. In the 1920s, there were two very famous seasons that were tournaments with Constant de Marie, and this one was with Carlos Enriquez. So where were the Mexican idols? There was no Mexican idol, although there were Mexican wrestlers, but they were only considered for seasons. They fought in smaller arenas than many that already existed. I mean, because really by the 1920s, there was already an Arena Mexico, Arena Coliseo, and an Arena Puebla are the ones we think of. I really don't know where Arena Puebla was. I've searched a lot, but I do know there was an Arena Puebla. Arena Coliseo was in Veracruz. Arena Mexico, managed by promoter Arturo Cava, was on Allende Street. Now, Allende Street intersects with the Paseo de la Reforma. Don't think it's the same as Arena Modelo, which Lutteroth later bought to hold his events. It's curious then that they say Lutteroth went to El Paso, Texas, to learn about an unknown sport and bring it to Mexico. In the early years, when he talked about the birth of the Mexican Wrestling Company, the definitive establishment of wrestling in Mexico, well, he changed it to leave only the establishment of wrestling in Mexico. Anyway, he was the public relations officer of the company. Good job. The idea remained that wrestling started there.
And the thing is, pro wrestling, Ernesto, at least in Mexico, is indeed based on many myths. We won't talk about all of them right now. And if people also remember any foundational myth of wrestling, we invite them to leave it in the comment. But I think it's part of the Mexican culture. The theme of this mythology, what we talked about with Velázquez for a long time, the theme that Fray Tormenta sponsored orphans who later became wrestlers, I've still come across people who continue to believe that Místico is Fray Tormenta's real godson. There's a lot of mythology behind it as part of the magic of wrestling. And many of us as children or young people believed in this mythology. And it gives that magic of going to an event. I think it has cemented everything you said, that wrestling is a spectacle as such. And it's a very integral spectacle that transcends beyond what happens inside a ring.
The truth is that those myths become less interesting than the reality of the sport itself. It's something I really enjoy discussing with Teddy Baños. We start finding things and enigmas. The biggest enigmas that Teddy and I have been investigating for years, each on our own, is about the wrestler Gil Larrea. Currently, as I'm writing a book about the life of Enrique Ugartechea, I came across a lot about Gil Larrea. A wrestler who was thought to be Spanish. Now, what I think is that he was from Tlaxcala. He was very famous in his time, but right now, almost no one remembers him. And the truth is that he was the national heavyweight champion. He must have been champion since the 1920s. By around 27 to 28, he was already being announced as the national heavyweight. Boxy Lucha magazine from the 50s or 60s, I don't remember well, where they talk about Gil Larrea and say he won the championship in 1910, that he won it from Ugartechea. That's surely false because he would have been very young and because Ugartechea didn't lose his championship, at least not in those years, because he continued defending it in Mexico City in 1912, 1913. In the 20s, he was still champion. By the way, it's also not known when Ugartechea lost the championship. There are theories that he did lose it to Gil Larrea, but it would have been in the 20s.
If someone watching this video, because we never know the reach these videos have, ends up being a relative or descendant of some of these characters, they might not like it. Well, Ernesto, let's wrap up this program. There are many more things to talk about. The intention is not to cover all topics in a single episode, and always thank you, Ernesto, for the time you dedicate to this podcast.
See you in the next one.
See you all. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you in the next edition.